You're about to hear how volunteer DNA sleuths used family trees to finally name a woman who had remained unidentified for 37 years. This is the Mary Silvani case, and the actual method they used that I'm about to tell you changed cold case work forever. I'll break it down step by step, so we will cover where the investigators found the DNA, how a public genealogy database gave them the needed matches, how those matches were then turned into family trees, and finally how they used all the random fingerprints to finally confirm who she was. So, let's dive in. This tragic story, which would span almost over 4 decades, began on 17th of July 1982. That day, a group of hikers went into the Sheep's Flat near Lake Tahoe in Washoe County, Nevada. This area was very popular at the time, and because it was a very beautiful day, the hikers were set for what they thought was going to be a very enjoyable day out, being surrounded by all these gorgeous views around them. But sometimes into the hike, they came upon something strange lying on the path near the Mount Rose Highway, which was just ahead of them. Now, at first, they didn't really know what they were looking at, because it certainly didn't look like it belonged there. But as soon as they walked closer to it, they began screaming. Lying on a rock in front of them was the deceased body of a woman. The investigators, after they arrived on the scene, they secured the area and began collecting as much information and evidence as they could. They quickly discovered that the woman, who appeared to be in her late 20s to mid-30s, had a couple of bullet wounds in her head and that they had been covered with male underwear. There were also 2 sets of footprints leading to the crime scene from the nearby parking area, but only one set of footprints then returned back to the supposedly parked car. This likely meant that this woman arrived with her killer and so must have had a personal connection with them. Now, there was another important clue supporting the fact that the victim likely knew her killer. And that is because it looked as if they just approached her from the back and shot her in the head while she was either sitting on that rock or she was maybe bending down, to trying to tie her shoelaces. So she wasn't really expecting the attack to happen. Judging from the way the victim was dressed, it looked like she was just out there for the day by the lake. She was wearing a powder blue t-shirt, jeans, yellow sneakers, and a blue bathing suit underneath the clothes. But apart from that, there was actually nothing else recovered on her that could give us an idea as to who she really was. There was no ID, there was no driver's license, nothing. Which meant that the investigators would be relying on someone logging a missing persons report that would then be able to be matched to this Washoe County Jane Doe they were just after discovering. But the investigators would be in for another surprise. When the body of this Jane Doe was removed from the scene and was submitted for the autopsy, it was also revealed that apart from having salad as her last meal, she had also been sexually assaulted. Now, this likely meant that her killer was actually a male, but apart from that, they had really nothing else to go on. And so slowly but surely, she began to be known as the Sheep's Flat Jane Doe, since nobody had any idea who she really was. Her description was posted all over the newspapers, hoping that someone would actually come forward to identify her. But in fact, the opposite happened. Nobody ever came looking for her. I mean, she wasn't even seen in the area the day before she was discovered, even though it was a very popular and highly frequented place. And so her remains were buried in a nameless grave, and despite the police having her physical description, clothing details, and other pieces of evidence, nothing ever led to confirming her identity. And so her case went cold. Now, by the way, there are other cases like this one, especially from the recent years. And so if you want me to cover more of these, then the best way to do that is by subscribing. For decades, the murders sat unsolved. Traditional tools like witness leads, dental records, and even fingerprint searches, they either failed or produced no match in the national systems. And for years, it was actually speculated that she must have been of European origins because of her dental work and innocuous scar on her arm that remained after a person had been vaccinated for smallpox, which was really prevalent in Europe at the time. But then this was actually disregarded in 2010 when an independent dental examination took place, hoping to provide more clues. And around the same time, it became clear that the woman was actually born in Michigan and that her father was of Italian descent. But actually it wasn't until 8 years later, in 2018, when the genealogy revolution finally provided the detectives with a new tool to try. In February of 2018, the Washoe County forensics investigator happened to attend this lecture led by Colleen Fitzpatrick. Now, Fitzpatrick, who is an American forensic scientist, genealogist, and entrepreneur who is also the co-founder of the DNA Doe project, which I'm going to go into in just a little bit. Back then, when the lecture was finished, the county forensics investigators began thinking that this method could actually help them solve many of their own cold cases. So the office contacted Fitzpatrick herself, and she, together with the DNA Doe project, helped them employ this new method of identifying victims and perpetrators. And as a result of this, the sheriff's office would finally receive the break in the Washoe Jane Doe case they so desperately needed and wanted. But first things first, here's a really quick explainer of how genetic genealogy works. First of all and any of the DNA evidence they had, well, that is converted into what is known as an SNP profile. This stands for single nucleotide polymorphism, and it basically forms a person's unique genetic fingerprint. This is also the same type used by consumer ancestry services that, especially in the recent years, have become rather popular. It basically means that these profiles can be now compared to public genealogy databases, and then these in turn can help find distant relatives. And so by doing this, the genealogists build family trees around those matches, tracing back to common ancestors and narrowing down living descendants, and they do this until a likely match emerges. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that this method is different from the CODIS STR matching, which is used for criminal databases. Genealogy uses only shared segments of ancestry to find relatives, but not exact criminal matches. So, how did this process of identifying the victim's identity go in this case? Well, firstly, the DNA had to be extracted. And luckily, the investigators had managed to preserve some biological evidence from when they took samples from the crime scene back in 1982. But that wasn't all. There was actually another seemingly unrelated misdemeanor loitering case from 1974, when they also collect a set of fingerprints. And with these in hand, modern labs were able to extract the much-needed DNA. And as a result of doing so, they produced an SNP profile which turned out to be suitable for the genealogy comparison. And in reality, this was a pretty extraordinary thing to do. To think that some fingerprints from a different case got preserved and kept, even though that they didn't need it to be, and then they were able to use it after all of these years without it being contaminated, and actually produce a match too, I mean, everyone called it a miracle. But this miracle would be the key to finally giving the Lake Tahoe Jane Doe her name. Now, when the extraction part was done, the newly established SNP profile was compared to public genealogy databases. It was mainly the GED match and then some other volunteer groups that were used for this. And as it would turn out, this produced matches to cousins, a nephew, and eventually even the parents of our Jane Doe. Now, naturally after this, the investigators were really keen to find those relatives in person. So volunteer genealogists and the DNA Doe projects, who have pledged to help naming the Janes and John Does out there, so really deceased people with no identification, well, these people examined those matches. And in the end, they were able to build a family tree that traced back to common ancestors, and then forward those to discover likely candidates. But of course, not every candidate would be a viable link. And so the investigators needed to narrow the list to find only those who actually provided a real connection to the victim in question. So they had to cross-check candidates against age, gender, geographic history, and also missing person reports. And in our case, the scientists zero in on the Silvani family from Detroit. They quickly found out that the parents, John and Blanche Silvani, as well as their 3 children, 1 daughter and 2 sons, were all believed to be deceased. But it would be actually the nephew and the closest living relative, Robert Silvani Jr., who would actually break the case wide open. Now, Robert was contacted to provide the DNA sample, and because he was eager to help, even though he never met his aunt, he gave whatever was necessary. And this led the genealogists to reveal the last piece of their missing puzzle, and their search for answers could be finally complete. And so in May in 2019, so 37 years after the murder, the Washoe County Sheriff's Office was able to confirm the identity of the Lake Tahoe Jane Doe, Mary Edith Silvani. Mary was just 33 years old when her life was cut short. She was indeed a daughter of an Italian man, but her family life was rather fractured. Her mother left when Mary was still a child, and her father passed away when she was just in high school. Now, Mary did have two brothers, but they sort of went their own ways, and so she was kind of left behind as soon as they moved out. It would also turn out that Mary had one child, but the baby was put up for adoption in 1972. And so with all of her closest family members gone or deceased, nobody was really looking for her. Now, her closest living relative is that nephew, but this man has never met her. But when the news of her murder hit the press, a couple of people came forward to tell us more about Mary. One was her friend from Mackenzie High School, which both teenagers attended in the 60s. And this was a woman named Nancy Cumming, who had published several photos of Mary as a 19-year-old teenager, as well as a bridesmaid. She said that many of her former classmates were saddened and shocked by how Mary's life actually ended. They all felt like they let Mary down, because she clearly needed help and support system around her at that time, but sadly she never received it. And then there were Mary's friends and neighbors from the time she lived in Detroit. And they said that there was more to Mary than being just a victim to a horrible crime. According to them, Mary loved anything and everything to do with art. She liked going to the Detroit Institute of Arts, she danced, she read. She was also an avid swimmer, and like many teenagers her age, she liked to hang around burger joints, listen to popular music, and laughed. She was supposed to be this sweet, unassuming girl who always seemed to be in good spirits but never talked about her private life or family. As the years went on, Mary drifted apart from her friends from high school. Many of them moved away. They, started their own families, got married, and so the women lost contact and Mary got sort of left behind. There was no record of her graduating, and there is no senior photo ever taken of her. And after her father passed away and her brothers left, Mary became actually homeless, living in shelters and even mental institutions. But whatever relatives she had left, well, they actually all believed that Mary passed away in 1980. And so when that fateful day in 1982 came and Mary's life changed forever, well, it is no wonder that her brothers did not report her missing or likely paid much attention to the murder in newspapers. To them, their sister had been gone, and so they very likely would have never made that connection that Jane Doe could have been their long-lost sister. I'm sure that many of you are now asking the million-dollar question. Who was Mary's killer? And is he now behind bars, serving for his heinous crime? Well, as it turned out, there's quite more to this side of the story. So, not long after Mary's identity was confirmed, the investigators and genealogists had one goal in mind: to find and trace the likely suspect. So, after about 2,000 hours of research later, and direct input from Fitzpatrick herself, they finally got a match. It was a grandson of this Texas couple. But here's the twist: the man was actually an illegitimate child fathered by one of the couple's sons. And the mother, who lived in Dallas, had this child out of wedlock and so raised him under a different family name: James Richard Curry. Now, some of you might be actually familiar with this name. And that is because Curry had been arrested in January of 1983 after confessing to 3 murders, making him a serial killer. And this was just 5 months after Mary's murder. So Curry, who was 36 at the time, did get his jail time, but unfortunately, he did not stay behind bars for too long. And that's because after he was taken into custody, well, he actually tried taking his own life, and he passed away a few days later from self-inflicted injuries. So, not having direct access to Curry himself, the investigators tracked his 2 children down, who voluntarily then submitted DNA samples. And that is when the case got solved completely. These samples provided the link between Curry and Mary, officially confirming his as her killer. And just like that, the case got closed. Unfortunately, the investigators or genealogists still have no idea how the day of Mary's murder actually panned out. We don't know whether Mary knew Curry, or whether she could have maybe been picked up as a hitchhiker, or even if she was perhaps kidnapped. These questions will always stay as speculations, but at least Mary now has her rightful name, and people can know her story. Her final resting place is no longer without a gravestone, and the long list of people without names has just gotten one shorter. This case is one of the early, high-profile examples of how genetic genealogy plays a very key part in solving long cold cases. But as much as it's helpful, it also raises a lot of questions. For example, like, when should public genealogy databases be used for law enforcement? Or how do we balance privacy for relatives with the need for justice? Well, as a response to this, many similar databases actually updated their policies after 2019 to allow their users to opt in or out for law enforcement use. But this now poses another question of how many cases will now never get to be solved because people opted out. Either way, let me know what you think of this case, and also what would you do if someone came knocking on your door requesting a sample that could potentially change the course of a case? Until next time.